So my family and I almost always miss that, so, announcements this morning. A couple of announcements. From Steve, the annual meeting will be held on May 22nd. If you have any reports, they are due by the 15th. Pat had just wanted to remind everybody that if you didn't receive your newsletter, you can pick one up on the table in the back and sign out that you did so that they don't mail it to your house. And also, lastly, Lorraine has tickets today for the Mohawk Valley Choral Society Spring Concert, which is in 2 weeks on Sunday, May 15th at 2 p.m. at Our Lady of Lourdes on South Genesee Street in Utica. Are there any other announcements anybody wanted to share? Let's us proceed to our musical call to worship.
Grant us the mind to know you. Let us feel you stir in our hearts. Fill our lives with your abundance. Show us how to play our parts in this changing world in which we make our way. Keep us in your love ever true.
I open this morning with the words of Gary Kowalski. We gather here to worship, to seek the truth, to grow in love, to join in service, to celebrate life's beauty and find healing for its pain, to honor our kinship with each other and with the earth, to create a more compassionate world, beginning with ourselves, to wonder at the mystery that gave us birth, to find courage for the journey's end, and to listen for the wisdom that guides us in the quietness of this moment. Please join me as we light the chalice.
We light this chalice for all who are here and all who are not, for all who have ever walked through our doors, for those who may yet find this spiritual home, and for those we can't even yet imagine. For each of us and for us all, may this flame burn warm and bright.
Join us for 326, Let All the Beauty We Have Known.
Let all the beauty we have known illuminate together giving thanks and praise.
Please join us in the words of affirmation. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with one another and with our God.
I never saw more, I never saw the sea, yet I know how the heather looks and what a wave must be. I never saw more, I never saw the sea, but there are things my heart will know, long before my eyes will see. I never spoke with God, nor visited in heaven, yet I am certain of a spot, as if the chart were given. I never spoke with God, He's not been shown to me, yet there are things my heart will know, long before my eyes will see. Yes, there are things my heart will know, long before my eyes will see.
I invite you to join me in a time of prayerful meditation with these words of Tamara Labak. Holy One, we gather this day to be reminded of the sacred and the ordinary, the holy moments of waking yet again to a new day, the feel of the earth beneath our feet, the crisp cool on our skin, the joy of being welcomed by fellow travelers, the warmth of this place. Help us this day to be fully present in our living, awake to each breath. Remind us, O God, that life is taking place in the in-between as well as in our lofty goals. Remind us, O God, that the detours and the details craft the path and make it our own. Help us to remember that we did not make this day, but that we have the glorious pleasure to greet each moment as it unfolds, to reach out and kiss its cheek as though it were a visitor who has come a long way just to see us. These and the prayers of our hearts we now lift up in the silence. Amen. Let's join together as we sing number 92, Mysterious Presence, Source of All. So, again, my name is Austin Eisele. Mark and Jeff asked me to speak here, and I thought that since this is my first time speaking with you all, you would indulge me a little bit with a little bit of an introduction about myself. You have seen my family and I here for the last year or so when we can be here. We were drawn here partly just because of our stage in life, and partly we were drawn here because I think, like many others, our experiences with church. I also personally was drawn here because in 1999, I had a short career as a bass clarinetist in the production of Oklahoma, and that was because of Mark Bunce. As my career started and ended very quickly, but it was very fun while it lasted, so, that also drew me here. In any case, both my wife Julie and I, we mostly grew up in this area. I'm from Ilion. She lived here in Little Falls and in Ilion. When we were young adults, we moved away, like so many young adults. And eventually I found myself as a minister in a small evangelical denomination called the Evangelical Covenant Church. I led congregations in Massachusetts and in Kansas. Typically, it's pretty small congregations, and I really enjoyed parts of the work. I'm kind of an academic type, so I really enjoyed boring people with lots of fun facts and sermons. I won't do that to you today, most likely. A couple of years back, I was a pastor in Kansas, and my family and I found ourselves in this situation where we thought we need a little bit more extended family support. And of course, 1,500 miles is pretty far for parents to drive for childcare and for other things. So we decided that it was time to kind of move back to where we're from, and at least to be able to be kind of a part of a larger support network than we had at the time. But since then, it's been a little bit strange for me, I have to admit. And maybe this is partly because I'm hitting midlife, and I hear from many people that this can be kind of a rocky time for people, midlife. Partly because of the circumstances have kind of knocked me off the path that I thought I was going to be on, and I sort of feel like you go down one of those hiking trails, and it ends, and there's this little trail you weren't expecting, kind of on the left, and you start going on that trail, and you know the name on the destination on the map. But you've never seen that destination, right? You've never seen pictures of it. You don't even really know what it's all about. And that's sort of where I kind of feel like I am right now in my life. I'm sure many of you here have either been in that situation at some point of your life. You might have that in your future, or maybe you're there with me as well, in my own kind of like in the middle of it. Sort of like, I guess they call this a midlife crisis, maybe. I don't know, sort of. But my wife and I, by the way, the other day were just joking how this whole midlife thing is sort of like another adolescence, which is weird because, you think you figure yourself out as a young adult, and then you hit this point where you start realizing that there are lots of things that you do that are like, I don't really actually want to do this stuff. This is not who I am. And you start to realize, wait, you are different than what this picture you've presented of yourself for so long. But this got me to thinking. If I can't easily see the destination I'm going to, if I'm having a hard time getting clear of what this path is that I'm on, it's like you're in the middle of the story, you don't really know the ending, how do I stay grounded on that trail? How do I not see all this and just turn tail and run, or even just freak out when I'm on that trail? This is a live subject for me. This is why I'm talking about it. For me, it's a live subject. Think about that for a second. It's not just like in the middle of, there's the age thing. There's like in the middle of a life circumstance. But in our world today, we're actually in the middle of a number of things that are very uncertain, and we don't really understand what's going on. I think the biggest example for me right now I can think about in the world that I think most of us can relate to is sort of what's going on with democracy across the world. It's not just in the U.S. I don't know if anybody heard about the National Front in France, which is basically a fascist party. Marine Le Pen, their leader, got 40% of the French vote this past week. 40%. 20 years ago, her father got about 10%. And we have, in our own country, we've had a leader who would like to undermine democracy so he can stay in power. And we have a country in Russia who is actively trying to destroy a democracy. This is a time we're in that it's a path that we have not been on for a while, and it's pretty difficult to imagine. I don't know if anybody here can imagine the end of the story, but it's pretty difficult to imagine the end of the story. So how do you stay grounded when you're in these situations? Now, I think virtually every religious tradition and lots of non-religious traditions have an idea of what that thing is you need to stay grounded, to keep on these difficult paths when you don't know the ending, to be in this story that you don't know the ending. And that's wisdom. Wisdom. From Socrates to Confucius to Solomon of Israel, the Buddha and the Sutras of India, wisdom has been an important part of virtually every religious tradition. Because the experience of being in the middle of life, or in the middle of a difficult situation, middle of uncertainty, and not knowing where the path is leading you, is a pretty universal experience. Just about every person has this at some time in their life. Now, just to lay my cards on the table, I preach in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I tend to look to that tradition for wisdom. Now, all traditions have these little maxims and sayings, or proverbs, right? And they're great sources of wisdom. One of my favorite proverbs, for instance, this is just an example, is from Proverbs 17, where it says, "A rebuke comes down on a discerning person more than 100 blows on a fool." This is a great little saying because the implication here is that a wise person, if you tell a wise person, if you give them constructive feedback, let's say, they'll take it and they'll run with it and it'll actually mean something for them. Whereas a fool, they don't really, you can tell them all you want and it's not really going to make an impact. I don't know I think we all have this experience, right? I have this person at work who I was their supervisor. And we don't. The term "fool" is kind of mean. It sounds kind of mean, but sometimes you really grasp what the idea is. But I have this person who had she basically was really smart and really talented, but was always creating conflict to try to get what she thought was an advantage. And if she had just used her intelligence and capability, she would have fulfilled her potential. And you could tell her that over and over again, and it did not make a difference. And that's what this proverb is talking about. But as awesome as these maxims and proverbs are, and they're really great, and I think most traditions have them, and they're provocative, they make you think, but they're not really the things that ground you when you're in the middle of it all. I mean, you can think about those proverbs. They're helpful. But it's actually not those kind of practical, pragmatic wisdoms that I'm talking about here, the thing that grounds me anyway. And this brings me to an earlier section of the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 8. You see, in Proverbs has a whole section of the book that is all about these little, small, short maxims. But the first part of the book is the whole thing about trying to convince a young person to follow wisdom. Now, if any of you here have been young or know a young person, you know what of a challenge that is, right? Because it is a stage of life as a young person where you actually believe that you have more wisdom than your elders, and you believe that you have better ideas than them. And it's pretty hard to anybody convince you otherwise. Proverbs tries to do it, and the strategy that Proverbs uses is it sets this kind of duality. There's lady folly and there's lady wisdom. Sort of like anybody know that Bob Dylan song, "Gotta Serve Somebody"? It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. It's that idea. You gotta serve either lady folly or you gotta serve lady wisdom. And so lady folly does the typical things that gets you into bad situations. Eventually you're not prosperous. Eventually you have all this conflict. Lady folly is not good. You don't want to go with lady folly. And lady wisdom is great. Lady wisdom will lead you to prosperity. Lady wisdom will lead you to stable relationships. And it's funny. Just like people who are fools, I'm sure everybody here, I'm sure there's many people in here who are wise. You know those people who they prosper, they're satisfied in life. When they do things, it just seems like they do things well, right? Now, this is pretty conventional stuff. Every religious tradition has this kind of duality. It's pretty conventional. And actually, I think if you took those first 8 chapters or first 8 or 9 chapters of Proverbs and you translated it in today's language, you could find it in like a personal growth section of a bookstore. It could be definitely translated. But what fascinates me is toward the end of chapter 8, there's this little short poem, and it's really not a conventional way people talk about wisdom at all. Not like your average person. If you're saying something, how do you get wisdom? This is not how people typically talk about it. And it sort of puts wisdom in this almost cosmic position. It's a kind of a strange little text, and it's a poem, and I'm going to read this poem, and I'm going to read the translation by the Hebrew scholar Robert Alter of this poem. And you can kind of see, the poem is spoken in the voice of wisdom, who is a woman. It says this: "The Lord created me at the outset of his way, the very first of his works of old. In remote eons I was shaped, at the start of the first things of earth. When there were no deeps, I was spawned. When there were no well springs, water sources. Before mountains were anchored, before hills I was spawned. He had not yet made earth and open land and the world's first clods of soil. When he founded the heavens, I was there. When he traced a circle on the face of the deep. When he propped up the skies above. When he powered the springs of the deep. When he set to the sea its limit, that the waters not flout his command. When he strengthened the earth's foundations. And I was by him, and intimate. I was his delight, day after day, playing before him at all times, playing in the world, his earth, and my delight was humankind." Now, this is not a kind of average way to think about wisdom. It's a strange kind of like almost philosophical or theological way to think about wisdom. And if you look at this first section, I find it very super fascinating. These first 4 verses talk about how wisdom is somehow primal. It's outside the divine, but being the first thing that was there. Look at the words. When there were no deeps, I was spawned. When there were no well springs, water sources, before mountains were anchored, before hills, I was spawned. Now, when you look at here, this language, it sounds pretty. It's pretty language. It's a nice poem. But there are very specific things that this poem is actually talking about in the Jewish or in the Hebrew world. And actually, I think Jeff actually put a picture like this up maybe last week or a couple weeks ago. this is kind of a picture of the cosmology of the ancient Near East. This is pretty standard. The entire ancient Near East, this is kind of how they thought about what the world looked like. If you think about this for a second, you have this picture up here. You can see there's the primal waters that are kind of all around. You see those primal waters, and they're not just below the earth or around the earth. They're above the earth. There's this ocean in heaven. And just think about that for a second as a person. You look above and you see blue. You know, we understand why the blue is there right now. But this is before the theories of the prism and of how light refracted, right? So it's made sense. Water came from up there and it was blue, right? So a lot of the stuff makes kind of a similar sense. But the basic sequence here is there's God, there's the primal waters, and then the earth is created. That's kind of how most ancient cosmologies, that's how they thought about it. There was this divine thing. If they're monotheistic like the Egyptians or the Israelites, there's this divine thing. There is the primal waters, and then there is the earth. Now, in this text, look at this says, I was there before all those waters. Wisdom is there before all of the primal waters. And if you think about this for a minute, the implication here is that wisdom is here before matter, before the material stuff of the world. The later tradition understood this idea to mean that wisdom is more primal, more part of reality than the things we can see and touch. And that's the basis for the fact that we can actually understand our world, that we can find our world makes sense at all. Now, science, obviously, we have a much more accurate picture of the world than this. But we also kind of assume the same thing. We also assume that there's something about the world, about reality, that matches our mind. I mean, scientists, when they try to explain, let's say, DNA, think about the analogies and metaphors they use. DNA is the building blocks of life. Building blocks are, it's a structured, it's an artificer type analogy for life. Or think about RNA. RNA scripting. This comes from as an analogy with kind of computer programming. We use these metaphors because we assume that somehow the world is intelligible. And for the ancients, this basically meant that wisdom was an essential part of the world. So when you're on these paths that you don't know, that doesn't make a lot of sense, there is actually something that makes sense about them. These paths, while we may not understand what's going on at this particular moment, we're in the middle of it. It's not just random events. There's a structure to it. There's a before and there's an after. There's causes. There's ways that we can, as people, understand what we're going through. Somehow, these events can be made sense of. Now, that's, of course, not really enough, because let's say you say to someone who's going through it right now, this will make sense. You just got to think about it a little harder. It doesn't really help that much, right? But in the second section, I think is really fascinating, because the poem continues, and I'm just going to read a little bit of the second section, and then we'll go back to this picture here. And it says, when he founded the heavens, I was there. When he propped up the skies above, when he powered the springs of the deep, when he set to the sea its limit, that the waters not flout his command, when he strengthened the earth's foundation. Now, look at the picture again. You see what he's talking about here. See what the poem's talking about. You can see how this works. You have the heavens that are protecting the earth from above. You have the round earth that is in the midst of these primal waters that are outside it. And you have the springs, and you can see this kind of picture. You have the springs that are giving water to the earth, the water the earth actually needs. That instead of this chaotic water, this water the earth needs. And you have these pillars of earth that are holding the whole thing together. And the poem is claiming that wisdom is there as a part of the development of this safe place, this differentiated place amongst the waters. And that's really what this is talking about. This is talking about wisdom as a differentiating agent, a way to differentiate between all this primal waters, and the safe space. Now, this was one of the most common ways the ancient people thought about creation stories. Most creation stories were some version of the Canaanite creation stories in the ancient Near East, the Canaanite creation story, which was there's this high god named Baal, and there's the god of the sea, Yam, and there's a big battle. And what the high god does is sets the limits for Yam. It stops Yam from overwhelming people. And if anybody's been to the Mediterranean or knows anything about it, the Mediterranean was one of those oceans that a storm would come up really quickly, and it was really damaging. There was a whole season where you couldn't sail on the Mediterranean. And there's this visceral feeling from people in that area, of course, that it's of the chaos of that. And even the Babylonian creation story, the goddess of the sea, Tiamat, is also the goddess of chaos. And when Marduk creates the world, Marduk kills Tiamat, rips her body up, and that is the center of the earth. That is the place that is safe among there. But it's not so much about necessarily only danger in a space of safety, as much as about wisdom as separating out a space where we are able to thrive. And if you think about this when you're in the midst of uncertainty and difficulty, it's often the process. In those are the times where we're getting clear about what's really valuable to you. And that's usually where the place of growth happens for people. What psychologists call the process of differentiation. Differentiation meaning just being clear on your boundaries, clear on who you are, and what's your responsibility and what's not your responsibility. This process can be really painful, and it's often in these times where we can really get clear on what's important to us, how we want to live our lives, and what is most valuable to us. I think it's so fascinating, this poem kind of puts wisdom in the context of differentiation, of actually creating this space where we can thrive. So, on the one hand, wisdom is there as kind of a baseline in all reality. Reality can make sense to us. On the other hand, wisdom is also a part of the process of differentiation. But there's this result that ends up happening. And I love this last section of this poem. It's one of my favorite parts of the Bible. And it says, this is the last section, and I was by him and intimate. I was his delight, day after day, playing before him at all times, playing in the world, his earth, and my delight with humankind. I so love this section because you have these such evocative words: intimate, playing, delight. You don't think of wisdom as something that's connected with delight and playfulness and intimacy. There's a joy when the world is intelligible. There's a joy when we start to get clear on what really matters to us. And if any of you have been in long-term relationships and you have these times where you do feel like you are really yourself, there's more joy in your relationship at those moments than you could ever have in other times. And it's funny because for myself, I also think about the joy that comes when you get clear on who you are. I've been in this process of changing my career path, and I'm doing some schoolwork, and I'm learning some stuff. And this past week, I had this moment where I had a problem that I had to try to figure out, and there was a relatively quick solution I could have gotten, but I kind of went down a rabbit hole. And I thought, if I can grasp this one concept, maybe it would help me. And it took me like 3 days and a lot of frustration. And eventually I grasped it. I figured it out. And I was at my desk and there's no one around. And I jumped up and I was just like, yeah! And I felt like a fool, but there's a joy that comes when you have these moments where you get clear on something, where something goes from just a little bit hazy to very clear. And you know at that moment, this is a really important part of the next step on my journey. And that's the joy that wisdom is talking about here. That kind of joy where you get clarity in the differentiation and you understand what's going on. And it's strange because when we are in the midst of a story that we really don't know the end of, we often do actually find the greatest joys. It's kind of one of those things that you sometimes wish it wasn't like that when you're when you're going through it, but afterwards you're like, this is the time where I felt the most joy. And I've often wondered if at its heart this poem is trying to express the idea that there is a growth, there is a connection between our growth in understanding, our growth in differentiation, and our growth into the divine, as if it's entirely natural that as we walk an uncertain path, wisdom is there so that we can grow into the divine, just as we grow into being more human. It's like the more human we are, the more divine we are. I'm not really sure if that's the case, but there's something very powerful about this poem, and the idea that somehow wisdom is suffused in all of life. I love the way the Italian writer Robert Colasso describes this, and he's talking about this from a Jewish perspective. He says, in the solitude before creation, Yahweh had only his daughter to help. His daughter was Torah, law, and Hokmah, wisdom. His consultant and his artificer too. She calculated the size of things, took care to plug the waters, marked where the sand should start, sealed the seams of the heavens. Sometimes she served as the open map of creation. The open map of creation. When you're on a path or in a story and you're unsure about the ending, it's difficult, lots of uncertainty, meditate on this. Divine wisdom as the map to that path. Amen. Won't you join me in singing 123, Spirit of Life?
We will do this 2 times.
I close our service with the words of Elaine Gallagher Gurnham. Walk softly, speak truthfully, love gently, breathe deeply, live wisely, go in peace.
Join me as we extinguish the chalice. The flame is extinguished,
but not our hope for the future, our courage in the face of crisis, or the love we share in all the world.
I got it.
Amen.